contributions historically that they have made, and they can understand the divine nature of who they are, then they will take a different type of investment and stock in their lives. Now, does that mean that the type of dynamic cycling that they're doing is going to end? No, and it shouldn't. But it does mean that there'll be possibly a lot more care about how that's expressed and displayed, if that's your concern. But in terms of the politicization, that's a big part of it, is sitting down with those young people, having that type of conversation and letting them know how valuable their lives are. The politicization also helps us to gear them toward using this as a method for social justice. Does the ride out have a cause? Is it going to a certain location? If it is to be disruptive, is it disruptive to the establishment and the white status quo, or is it antisocial? And I think what you will find in, even if we look at hip hop culture, when it was at its peak during its conscious era in the 80s, it was anti-establishment. It wasn't primarily anti-social. And now what we have is a culture that is controlled, honestly, by the white status quo in terms of the record industry. And now the music is anti-social. And so it begins to implode on itself. And so being able to control the culture is a form of politicizing it. And young people understanding that this is something that the community should control and should be something conducive to the healthy growth of our community is also critically important. And I think when you have an atmosphere like that, organization is a tool that can be used where we can use this for our health and wellness. I mean, literally, you got a mass of young people who are getting on bikes and exercising and doing things in sync and harmony. And if we have to look at what exists, these are people who can come together in an organized fashion and do something in sync and in time. And at a high level of it, many of us can do things in sync and in time, but on a wheelie with one leg, that's extreme. And so that's a high level of intelligence that will be optimized if we politicize it and organize it.
Yeah, as we come to a close here, y'all, in our 3 minutes, and perhaps we'll have a minute or so just for some quick feedback, debrief from you all. There's 3 levels that we want to think about in terms of moving to a place where we're able to politicize this culture. One is the community. How do we create a community that protects itself against white supremacist violence, against police violence and vehicular violence and interpersonal violence? What is it about our community that would allow us to create some systems and structures and processes and other things that allows us to protect ourselves? And then at a structural level, you know, the root cause of all violence, of all injustice experienced by Black, brown, and indigenous people in our society is structural racism. So we could do a whole lot in our community and still be victimized by structural racism. So what are the structural solutions to dismantle structural racism, to remove racialized inequities and improve life outcomes for our communities? And then the third part, which I think is critical, is it looks like we have a little more time. Looks like we got until 2:30. Okay. So the next part that I think is critical, and that is healing. Equiticity did a research study called Mobility Justice in Chicago. And we did focus groups with Black and brown people who are low to moderate income living on the South and West Side. 1:30. All right, cool. 1:30. So we got an extra 30 minutes. 1:30 Central Time. So we got an extra 30 minutes. So we did this research study targeting Black and brown people living on the South and West sides of Chicago. Chicago is one of the most segregated cities in the world, and it's mostly Black and brown, low to moderate income on 2 parts of town. And in that research, we uncovered the degree to which people are deeply concerned about violence, and those concerns shape their mode choice. People are making decisions around walking, biking, taking transit, or driving with violence front and center. The vast majority of violence we experience is during the act of mobility. It's while we're walking in a neighborhood or riding a bike in our neighborhoods or somewhere in our city or driving or taking transit. The vast majority of violence experienced in our communities, whether in our neighborhoods or in our cities, is during the act of mobility. And that trauma, as a result, is real. And I would venture to say, for Black and brown people who live in our neighborhoods, we've either experienced violence firsthand or we know someone who has. And I'll give you a quick example. Yesterday, an 11-year-old boy was riding his bike here in my neighborhood on the west side of Chicago. The neighborhood is called North Lawndale. He was riding his bike on 16th Street. He was hit by a car and killed. And there were plenty of people out there. He's a twin. He's a twin. His twin is left without him. And his cousin rides with Equiticity. We do a Friday night ride every Friday night in this neighborhood. And his cousin, the cousin of the boy who was killed riding his bike in my neighborhood, rides with us. So this violence and trauma that we experience, it's not far removed. We experience it personally, or we know people. We know people well, people we love and care about who've experienced this violence. We are not in a position to think about trauma and mobility separately. They are inextricably linked. And part of this work, part of our work around mobility has to focus on trauma and the healing necessary for us to grow our mobility. All right, so how about a time check? So how are you doing on time? I think I anticipated that this was going to be an hour. How are you doing on time, Rifa?
Oh, I'm great.
So should we push through?
Please.
We're going to push through. All right, Naomi, we're going.
All right, let's go.
All right, so I say now it's time for us to have some discussion. We went through, and I'll just do a quick recap. We went through our agenda. We talked about the incident in Rosedale, which was framing this conversation. We talked about where some of those same young people are now, some 50 years later. We talked about the connection between what our young people in the mid-70s experienced in Rosedale, riding their bikes and being traumatized and attacked violently, to ride out culture today, where our young people are riding bikes in a way that fits their personalities, and experiencing three types of violence: police, vehicular, and interpersonal. We talked about the potential of us as thoughtful revolutionaries to have some impact in a way that does not disrupt this culture, help those who are ready to begin to think about how this culture could be used in a way to improve our condition. We talked about there's a three-step process, one being mobilization, two being politicization, and three being organization. And we talk about this work happening at three levels. How do we as a community protect ourselves? How do we address the structural, systemic challenges in our society? And how do we move our people towards healing, given the trauma that we experience and the violence we experience? So with that, let's open it up. It's time for y'all to talk to us, engage in some discussion for our next 25 minutes. Let's go.
There was also a question in the chat from Mr. Gallo about how can the movement benefit from the potential corporatization of this culture coming?
Yeah, I'll thanks. I'll speak to that a little more. I sent you the article that I was referring to that's in the British version of GQ about bike life, and how it's being portrayed there as a real positive activity of people coming together and enjoying this form of cycling. And in a quick search of it, I also came across stories from New Jersey and Philadelphia about how it's portrayed in this horrible teenage sort of taking over the streets types of positioning. And it's like it's two worlds separated by a common language. Once again, but whether it's been skateboarding or snowboarding or whatever sort of alt types of activities or sports have eventually entered the mainstream because those who like to make money off things eventually see profit in being able to capitalize on something that is kind of fringe. So I really wonder in the moving forward of not just trying to politicize and engage and organize these very exuberant cyclists, how can they economically benefit from the sport themselves versus somebody else taking it from them? So that's and I there's a million synapses firing in my brain because of this conversation. Not only am I here on the near west side of Chicago right now, and as I mentioned, also have a home on the west coast of Florida where I moved from 20 years ago to Chicago, but I grew up on Long Island, not very far from Rosedale itself. So as a Buddhist would say, there's something very auspicious about this conversation, and I hope that it leads to something substantive, even if it's here in Chicago and Florida. And you and I can talk about that later on, how I might participate in some type of outcome here. And in my professional life and working with nonprofits, I've always thought about starting with the outcome, and I think it's important for this conversation, whether it's in this final 20 minutes that's left, or subsequently, really decide upon a couple of outcomes you really want to achieve and then figure out how do you get to them. So thank you.
I appreciate that, Bob. I'll share a little context for folks who may not be aware. I talked about this culture being big on the East Coast and West Coast. It's also big on the coast around the country, in Florida also. And it's big in Europe, especially in the UK, especially in London. And as you may imagine, those young people who are doing some of the same stuff our young people are doing here, riding front wheel up in the traffic, taking over streets, thousands. Most of them are white. And what Bob is talking about is how the story is being told in a city like London versus how the story is being told in a city like Oakland or in Brooklyn or in Miami. It's a very different narrative. However, it's the same culture, whether we call it bike life, ride out, 29er, it's the same culture. You look at what they're doing the same thing. And that gentleman D Blocks, he is the father of the culture in London, the same way he's the father of the culture here in the US. So I'll quickly respond to your question, Bob. One, you're right, it's coming. The corporatization of the culture is coming. We live in a capitalistic society that will ensure where there's profits, they will be maximized. And when you're getting thousands of young people who are interested in some new products or spending any money they have on some new things, that people are going to find a way to put products in front of them. So it's coming. So how do we address that? I don't know. I'll tell you some of the things we're thinking about. One is we are in the early stages of manufacturing bicycles through a worker co-op here in North Lawndale. North Lawndale is on the west side of Chicago, predominantly Black, predominantly low to moderate income, with all number of racialized inequities in this community. And we want to create a worker co-op where the workers own the business and benefit from that financially through the profits of the business. And the workers are young people in the neighborhood that we train up to weld, to bend steel, to add component parts to bikes, to understand marketing and customer service and accounting. We want to specifically go after young people in this neighborhood and bring them into the co-op. And one potential bike, and again, we're in the early stages, one potential bike that we could manufacture is a 29er bike. And when that bike is being purchased, the people who are benefiting are young people in the neighborhood. So that's just one potential approach to ensure that young people are owning some of these businesses that are going to begin to proliferate to take advantage of this ride out culture. Reefa, any ideas on your side around how do we stop the corporate takeover that's coming, whether we like it or not?
Sure. It's a loaded question. I'm not sure I can cover all the answer in the time that we have, but I'll try to be as concise as I can. I think when we look at it, we have to understand that in terms of the media is controlled by white psychopathology. And as long as that is the case, whatever narrative they spin is what it will be. With that being said, it is important for us as a community, in whatever insular ways that we can, to control our narrative in terms of its origins and things like that. But this kind of Elvis Presley effect has been going on in this country for a long time and will continue to go on as long as white psychopathology is the normative expression of culture of the day. And when you asked earlier about how do we change this from a structural point of view, I think history has already taught us that the structure is inherently flawed. And so in order to levy pressure on this type of infrastructure, you have to have an independent political organization. And there have been independent political organizations throughout our history that were very impactful for people of African descent. The UNIA under Marcus Garvey, the Black Panther Party, just to name a couple. But when you have that level of organization, political organization as an independent party, now you can run your slates and levy pressure on the political infrastructures that exist in the white status quo to gain some power. But ultimately, in order to really have a sustainable impact, the entire infrastructure that exists in terms of the status quo has to be completely dismantled and done away with. It has no redeemable value. And I think that is the crux that, a lot of folks are struggling with, is because we want to preserve some aspect of it. And you see a lot of this coming up in conversation today. I do think on a local end, Tom mentioned earlier an incident that happened with our brother Najari. There's a lot of cycling infrastructure and big money going into it in the state of California for alternative forms of transportation, particularly cycling. And so there was a safe bike zone that was created on the street, and it's just for cyclists. And Najari was stopped for riding while Black, if you will, in this safe Black zone. Now, this is an area created for cyclists where you should be able to ride your bike without being harassed, bothered, and anything. It's literally infrastructure, millions of dollars put into this for you to ride safely. And the police chose to go into that safe zone and harass them. So it begs the question, who is the infrastructure for? Who is it created for? Where are these resources going? And so to our non-Black allies who are out there who work in these areas, it's going to require more conversation for them to be politicized and for them to step up and to ensure on the front end, when this planning is taking place, that the people who will be most impacted in those communities are at the deciding table and who have a significant voice to say where those resources will be spent, how they will be spent. When the bike lane was painted through my historically Black neighborhood in West Oakland, the question that the people had was not so much, do we need a bike lane? Of course we do. But who is it for? Because what came with that bike lane was rapid gentrification. And gentrification is a violent act. And so if we want people to embrace these alternative forms of transportation in terms of cycling culture, because we're trying to promote these healthy lifestyles, then we have to make sure that it is not tethered to toxic white hegemony. And so if we want to have this type of impact, going back to the original question, in terms of making sure that those resources properly go to those young people where they can use it, then we're going to have to dismantle these type of societal infrastructures that seek to do us harm.
Good stuff. All right, thank you for that question, Bob. Anybody else? Question, comment? We got about 15 minutes to rock out together. Let's talk.
Yeah, if I might, thank you, Rifa. That was really powerful and got me thinking about all kinds of things. But relevant to this larger discussion of ride-out culture and to infrastructure, I think I see folks like Najari and folks like Obayi advocating for physical infrastructure in their communities. We need to protect the physical bicyclist from cars. And I see how the societal infrastructure appropriates that and says, look, Black people want bike infrastructure too. So we need to do it in our way. And I think that's the dynamic that we need to grapple with. It's like, it's not that Najari doesn't want a bike lane. It's that Najari is a Black man existing in our society. And I really like this concept that Sarah Suleiman, who writes for Streets Blog LA, talks about, of centering the person rather than the infrastructure in your thinking. So like, what's going on for that kid who's part of ride-out culture and is learning skills and doing these dangerous things? And how would we address what his needs are? I don't know the answer to that, but I think that reframing, I think, helps thinking about like, what's the best thing to do about it?
There's an example of an infrastructure project in Oakland that I look to often, and I know, you know, my understanding is nowhere near close to people who live in Oakland, and there's some concerns about that same infrastructure project. However, I think it is a step in the direction of where we want to go, and that is 98th Street. Is that right? Is that the street I'm thinking about? The Scraper Bikeway?
90th,
where,
yeah.
90th?
Yeah.
Where the Scrapers work closely with OakDOT to envision and implement that bikeway. One of the things I love about it is that it reflects their culture, their ethos in the bikeway. And it's a step towards what we as at Equiticity are advocating for, and that is community ownership of the transportation planning process. There's a lot of challenges with how transportation infrastructure is delivered in our neighborhoods. One of those challenges is that the planning process is owned by an agency, whether it be a DOT or an MPO. It's the agency that owns the planning process, and they've oftentimes envisioned the infrastructure in our absence. And then when they're ready to come to us, it's already baked, and they're saying, will you all support our vision? And most of the time, the people in those agencies are white, middle to upper income, and don't live in our neighborhoods. Our position is that we must own the transportation planning process. Now, look, that is a tectonic shift away from how our the transportation sector operates in this country. However, that's required given the harms that have been enacted on our neighborhoods, from the monuments to racism that the transportation sector built in our society. Today we call those highways, to traffic violence, mostly impacting Black and brown people, to infrastructure contributing to displacement and gentrification in our neighborhoods, and so many other inequities that's coming as a result of transportation. We need a tectonic shift away from how this sector operates. Our position is that Black and brown led organizations in our neighborhoods must own the transportation planning process. And it doesn't mean that the DOTs and the MPOs are boxed completely out. They bring something to the table. They bring financial resources. You're not going to ask us to own it. You're not going to expect us to own it, and we do your job and we don't have the financial resources to do it. When we get to a place where we're owning that transportation planning process, we want the resources that goes with it. The same resource those DOTs and MPOs give to these white-owned engineering firms and these white-owned consulting firms, or they're paying all of these white people in their offices to do this work. Bring those same resources to us and we'll own the transportation planning process ourselves. They also bring some technical expertise. We have Black and brown people, many on this call. I see some people. I see Ariel. My sister Ariel is on this call. We have some of that expertise. However, in some neighborhoods, it may not be as much as prevalent. So these DOTs and MPOs bring that technical expertise, and then they bring some parameters. You know, there's some things that we're unable to do. We can't make a bike lane go through a gangway, right? So there's some important parameters that we have to keep in mind. The idea, though, is that the ownership of infrastructure coming into our neighborhoods must be transferred and activated with us in our neighborhoods. All right. We got 9 minutes. Let's push through, y'all. Come on. Who got next? Ariel, you want to share any thoughts?
Well, just to echo what some of what you said, Obi, it's oftentimes what has happened is that I did some research for an organization called Bike East Bay. And so there was a concern that the Black community wasn't as interested in some of this bike infrastructure and alternative forms of transportation. And like I said, the people did not see it separate from gentrification. So it wasn't that they were against cycling. It was the nature of how it was imposed into the neighborhood. And I think oftentimes, you know, we're putting the cart before the horse. If you want people to be engaged in this, then we need to create, well, we need to use, because the resources are there. We need to use said resources in a way where we get people from the community, first of all, who know how to talk to their own people in that community about the subject, and to inform folks about how and why it's important for us to have these type of infrastructures, how they will benefit, and to get the community input on, okay, well, we think it should look like this and it should function this way. And these are some fundamental ways that it can improve our day-to-day life. And that's what's missing. I usually feel that it comes after the fact that these questions are asked, after the infrastructure is already created, because it is created, we have to be honest about this, it is created with the thought that the community that it's going in will not exist. And this will be an infrastructure to bring more money and more eyes on a neighborhood that can be taken over by other folks. So as much as there was angst in the was it Roseville?
Rosedale.
Rosedale, we got a Roseville in California. In the Rosedale neighborhood about, you know, the white folks being upset about, you know, the foreign Africans coming in and taking over their neighborhood. You know, you have to understand that they are doing just that to our community here. to push us out to where there was none of us left, except for us. There is no other place to run. And that's why you see this explosion of homelessness in our city and across this country. And so we have to create or utilize those resources to inform and educate people on the front end before the infrastructures are created.
Awesome. All right, we got about 6 minutes, y'all. Our dear sister Ariel is who we call a practitioner. Let's go.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, so I had two thoughts. We recently just worked on a grant that was for, well, historically Black community. And as a part of that grant, there was like a narrative that had to be written. And of course, like you were saying, you know, one of those consulting firms that don't have any people of color, that have no context. And I actually used to work for the one that we hired. So I knew personally that they weren't going to do the community justice in a way. And I thought it was interesting. A lot of as people, I guess, become more woke around like bicycling and Black and brown communities, is this like the way that they would write stuff is just like, Black people don't want bike lanes, or like if we put in bike lanes, they think it's gentrification, they don't think it's for them. And so I had to go back and rewrite a lot of that narrative and say they don't think it's for them because when they asked for it, nobody paid attention. And now the people are coming, you know, more white people, more affluent people are moving into their neighborhoods, and they're asking for things that, you know, this historically Black community has asked for decades. And now they're putting it in. So I think, like, I don't know how to explain it, but there's like a lack of understanding maybe. So like, even though it may appear that a lot more agencies and companies are, you know, starting to try to understand the relationship of Black and brown neighborhoods and like bike infrastructure, they think they do. They can put in a couple of buzzwords, but they really don't. So I think that's something that we have to just be really intentional about looking out for, because they definitely do not have the narrative right. And
Totally.
It just, I don't know, but I was like, that's not why it is. And I think the other thing is, and I think I've been thinking this for a long time, sorry, we have all of the tools that we need. We just have to want to use them. Because like, how long have we been talking about having communities involved in the planning practice? How long have we been talking about leading with people instead of infrastructure? How long have we been talking about spreading the resources to communities of color instead of, you know, whoever else? And so as I like sit in these conversations and some of the kind of the same ideas or same solutions come up, I'm kind of like, what's the next step? Because we have the tools and they have the tools too, but they don't want to use them.
For sure. Ariel, there's no better way to end this conversation with you than with you and your thoughts there. Just real quick, because we are being called to wrap. In the event we're able to get contact information, I'm happy to explore with my brother Rifa some next steps, you know, separate from this conversation, for folks who are ready to continue to move forward together. Just one quick thing I'll say, that the solution must be structural. The problem is structural. The solution must be structural as well. Rifa, we got to wrap it in about 30 seconds here. Any closing thoughts, brother?
Mobilize, politicize, and organize.
There we go. All right, everybody, let's ride. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye.